I will be talking today about the one of the Express tools, a very specific workflow in today's presentation. Actually, this is one that I've had discussions with a number of the BIM managers on the phone that I see here on our list here, and this has to deal with how to standardize type naming in Revit. And in a lot of cases, people come to me with different questions about different workflows, and in a lot of cases, my answer usually revolves in some form around Spreadsheet Link. And so today I'm going to be showing you how to leverage Spreadsheet Link to manage type naming using properties inside of the types to manage the type naming while you're in a project. This won't necessarily help you before you get to the project directly, though you can probably even use some of this to help you a little bit with generating type catalogs if you get real tricky with it. Wouldn't be that difficult, actually. I'm going to show you today how to do type naming inside of Spreadsheet Link. Now, before I do that, let me actually talk a little bit about some of the issues that I've had come up that are very specifically related to this issue. So a lot of the companies that I work with do have some variation of standardized content. Some of it's very standardized, some of it's kind of loosely standardized. Usually within that, there's also some suggestions internally about how to name types within the actual component families that are being loaded in, and even system families for that matter. Unfortunately, users either aren't aware of those things or don't really care or are getting lazy, and they're not consistently following naming standards. And what happens is when you have other users who are also in the project, or even the same users, when they're generating a type, sometimes they don't rename it properly. And then trying to find out what's in that type later on can get a little confusing. So usually what will happen is that users will generate multiple types that are exactly the same thing, but they all have different varying random names, and that can be a problem. So what will happen then is other users are having difficulty understanding type names in general if they're not being consistent with naming conventions, or again, they're just duplicating multiple types. Or I've also seen midstream in a project, naming conventions change because the company has made a decision to go with a different naming convention because it was more clear than the previous convention. A lot of different reasons this might actually happen. But how do you standardize this? Or one more thing, also I've seen with just system families where you can't have like a type catalog. Maybe you've gone through as a BIM manager and you've made a number of wall types or conduit system types or whatever the case may be. Trying to get those modified to have the correct properties and then also have the names line up with those settings can sometimes be a trick. So what is the tool that I propose for this? Well, again, a lot of my answers usually revolve around Spreadsheet Link. So if I have a couple of examples that I'll show today, literally two examples, one that's architectural and one that's electrical based, or actually I guess MEP based, where I can show you how to automate some of your naming standards based on rules, based on properties that exist in the family. There's a lot of things you can do with Excel that you can't do with Revit. That's just straight up based on some of the formula control that Excel has that does not yet exist in the Revit environment. But because you've got Spreadsheet Link, you can use that power of Excel to actually automate the naming instead of Revit. So this process is repeatable. I can save my Spreadsheet Link settings and run it on the same project multiple times over the life cycle of the project. I can also use this on multiple different projects by saving the settings out to an external file. And I can also, by using Spreadsheet Link Express, kind of a companion tool to Spreadsheet Link, make it set up such that users themselves can run my settings and never actually have to see the Spreadsheet Link window with all the settings inside of it. They can just run the tool and say, run these settings on my project, get all my types configured, and it'll modify everything pretty consistently. So with that, let's actually jump into Revit. Today I want to try and focus primarily on actually showing Revit more than PowerPoint like I have in some of my presentations. So let's Control-Tab or Alt-Tab over to the Revit environment here and see what we've got going on. So my first example here, is going to be an architectural example. I'm going to go to my first floor plan here and take a look at some of the doors that I've got. I'm going to use this for my door configuration first. And this, by the way, even works when you have doors from multiple sources and possibly the different sources have varying naming conventions on them for the types. So in this case, if I click on this door here, this happens to be one of our super doors. Its name is Swing. And it is HM-00 because I know my naming convention, that's my frame type. The next there's an underscore, then the next option here is F, that's the panel type, underscore, and there's the size, 32 by 48. Now this happens to have a 2 after it because somebody duplicated this door and perhaps didn't name it properly. As a matter of fact, if I look at the type information inside of here, the actual panel type, the type name indicates it's a flush panel, but the actual panel type here, in my case, looks like it's a full glass panel. Well, that's inconsistent information. If the user was going to drop this in, whoever duplicated this just got a little bit lazy, and people will do that. They'll duplicate and they'll forget to rename it after the fact. But that's why I'm building this little routine here inside of Spreadsheet Link to help fix this for all of my doors across the project. Now, if I look over a little further over here, clicking on this door, this happens to be a door from some completely different standard. In fact, it's a door interior double flush. But for whatever reason, it says DR on it. In fact, all of the doors from this particular source all say DR. I don't know why. It has nothing to do with the type, but that's what it says. And then it says underscore, and it gives me the size of the door in feet and inches, width by height, but it's feet and inches. And the naming convention just doesn't match up with what I've got set up already in my project with the, well, let me go to a door that actually does match the standard, HM00 underscore F underscore inches by inches, width by height. So I'm going to go through and use Spreadsheet Link to actually modify all the doors across my entire project to get them all to align with my actual standard that I want to be using. So to do that, I'm going to go here to my Revit Express tool. I'm going to call up Spreadsheet Link. Now in Spreadsheet Link, I'm going to use a feature that I haven't seen a lot of people use much lately because maybe they don't realize it's actually there. I'm going to show you exactly where to go find this. By default, when you're leveraging Spreadsheet Link, this is showing you instance objects. If I just grab the categories here and let's go grab door categories, I'm going to get a list of every single inserted door in my project. Only those that are inserted, though. Those that actually have instances placed. There might be a number of types that aren't placed, but this is going to give me a list of all of those that are. If I use this, this is like using a Revit schedule of sorts. It shows me every individual instance. If you drop this list down here at the bottom, though, you could also choose if you wanted to use schedule, which is still listing instances, but it bases it on a schedule, so you don't have to manually go through and pick your fields and pick the order of the fields. You can just go ahead and choose a schedule that already has a bunch of fields in it, which is also great. But that's also not the feature I'm showing today. Today we're talking about type naming. So I'm going to go here and use this types list. There have been a lot of times when I'm working with a lot of BIM managers, and they've been wanting to go through and just make a number of type edits, type modifications, just to the data inside of types. This is a fantastic way to do that. It's also a great way to do something as simple as naming a type. So I'm going to go here and grab the door type specifically. I'm going to add that across. Now, as I add that across, it's going to list out the door types, of course, in here. And it's going to list out just one row per type value. Now, I can't really see that just yet because I haven't added any fields to it. But if I go in here and I grab, for example, I don't know, we'll grab the type name as the first object here. So type name, there it is. Every one of these are type names. And you can see here that one standard is DR underscore for every single door, and then it lists out the width by the height in feet and inches. I'm going to get that DR underscore stripped from every single one of those names, and I'm also going to convert this so it shows it in inches by inches, width by height. In addition to that, down below here, I've got some of my doors that are actually a part of the super door, which have a frame type and a panel type. And I'm going to get those in case they happen to be misnamed down here like this one. I'm going to get those to update. Now, a few of these here are actually panels. They don't belong in my list, so I'm going to have to filter those out. I'm going to show you how to do that as well, based on properties that I know. So I'm going to grab the fields that I want, and for my convenience, I'm going to go ahead and grab them in the order that I want. So I'm going to grab frame type as one of my properties. That's the first one that I want. I'm going to grab the panel type. I'm going to grab the width of the door, and I'm going to grab the height of the door. So those are the 4 fields that I want to be used for my actual type name over here. Now, what I'm going to do with those is I'm going to tell it, first of all, that I don't want the panels. Now, one thing you'll notice about the panels specifically, I know these are panels because I know how my project happens to be set up, but these are panels, panel types. I don't want them in my list. And you'll notice that panel types don't have a width or height. They also don't have a panel type or a frame type value. Well, some of these other doors don't have a frame type or panel type value either. But what I'm going to do is filter it out by saying any door that doesn't have a width to it. This, by the way, is actually a curtain wall door. It doesn't have a width. So it's going to get pulled out of my list. Maybe I want it. Maybe I don't. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this flush panel here. I'm going to get those panels filtered out. So I'm going to go to my filters here and tell my filter that I want to only include doors whose width is greater than 0. I'm just going to choose that from my list. That'll get rid of every door type that doesn't really belong here. So if it's greater than 0, which is all of my legitimate types other than my curtain wall doors, which I'll have to handle those manually in a different way, it's going to filter out those other objects inside of here. Now that I've got the content that I want, I'm going to go over to the left-hand side here and start configuring how I want these type names to actually exist. Now, before I do that, one more thing. I'm going to tell this that it's going to be a calculated value, that column. So I only have to put the formula in once inside of here, and that makes this process repeatable on every single project that I've got in my, in my repertoire, because I can just go back through here and run this setting because it's going to automatically calculate everything about this column. So in my very first row, my very first data row here, what I'm going to do is tell it that I want it to equal, and if I use something down here, you can see I've got the frame type, the panel type, the width, and the height. So let's start with that. I'm just going to say equals up here, just a basic Excel formula, equals this, and by using concatenation, I'm going to do and this, and this, and this. All right, so if I just hit enter right now, all of these type names get configured to include all those properties. If I scroll down, you'll see HM, F2, 8 foot by 7 foot. Yep, so I've got all those objects right there with that little configuration. But that's not really what I want to see. I want to see some underscores in between those fields. I'm going to go ahead and put quote underscore quote and. The and, by the way, is a little concatenation symbol. I really wish Revit had this built into it so I could do this within my own formulas in Revit, but it doesn't have that yet. So I'm going to do this in Excel. I'm just going to copy this and cheat a little bit and put that between each of these individual fields here. And this one here, I'm not going to put an underscore. Instead, I'm going to put a little lowercase x. Now, when I do that and I hit enter, it's going to go through and modify all my fields. So here you can see I've got HM00 underscore full glass. That's the new type name. It used to be F and it used to have a 2 at the end, underscore, and then the size of the door in feet and inches right now. I also up here where I don't have panel and frame types have a bunch of extra underscores. That's not really what I'm looking for. So I'm going to add where it says D4 here just a little bit of logic. And if you're familiar with Excel or even Revit's formulas, this logic should be somewhat familiar. For right now, just so you can see this without all this extra junk up here, I'm going to cut it by using Control X. I'm going to pull that out. I'm going to put in a little if statement here for you. I'm going to put if this field, let's see here, D4, I can't click it because my cursor's over there right now, D4 equals nothing if it's empty, then what I want it to do is be nothing. I don't want to put anything there. Otherwise, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the value of D4, and I'm going to actually do a little mini concatenation here, and quote underscore quote. So it's actually going to put the underscore in there right there. So if I just hit enter right now, all of these become nothing. Down here, you're going to see HM00 underscore. You can actually put that name in there with an underscore following it. Now, I'm going to put the remainder of that formula up here. So I have the original stuff. I'm going to pull out that first little concatenation so you can see what happens. These up here now only have one underscore. Down here, I've got HM00 underscore and the panel type, which is kind of what I want. One more thing. I want to make sure that if it doesn't have a panel type, it also doesn't put that underscore there. So I'm going to do the same exact thing for the next field here. So I'm going to just copy this real quick here, copy, and I'm going to replace the E4 portion there. I'm going to replace that in here too. E4, E4. All right. So now it says if D4 is empty, do nothing. Otherwise, put the D4 value in an underscore. And it's going to concatenate the next part here too. If E4 is empty, put nothing. Otherwise, put E4 in the underscore. And then it goes on and does the rest of what I want it to do inside of there. So that's the first little bit that I need to have. So what it does now, it should, should go through and fix that. Did I do something incorrectly? Oh yeah, I put the underscore here still. I got to get rid of that. My fault. There we go. So now it strips out that underscore. So basically on all of my previous doors here that had the DR underscore on the side. I stripped out the DR underscore part in front of it. And if it does have a panel type or a frame type, it'll put that value in front of it like it does down here. So my naming convention is all configured almost. And if it doesn't have a panel type, it just puts the size of the door. So kind of modified my standard a little bit. One more thing. I mentioned earlier that I like inches instead of feet and inches. I don't feel like feet and inches reads very well inside the type names. It gets a little bit long sometimes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert all of these values over here to inches, only inches. Here's the trick. Normally when you export this, if I'm doing this in Excel, I have to do all kinds of, trim statements to trim off different things. I have to read if it's a certain length of characters. Things like fractional inches becomes really tricky. I got a really quick trick for you here. Down here at the bottom, there's an option that says hide unit symbol. This will give you the raw internally stored value of Revit. Now, the raw internally stored value of Revit is in feet by default. So that means that those of you who do metric stuff, you may have to do a little bit of conversion on this, but it will give you at least the base value here. It does tell you that it's going to rebuild your spreadsheet and you're going to lose any kind of changes that you've made, including things like the formula that you put in. I happen to have copied this formula ahead of time because I knew it was going to do that. So what I'm going to do is just repaste that right back in here for you. So there we go. We've now got that formula put in there. Trick is, though, I don't want 3 by 7 or 2.6666667 by 7. That's a little crazy. That's going to be a little bit worse and a little harder to read. So instead, I'm going to go in here and take that value times, in my case, times 12. And I'll do the same thing over here for the G4, times 12. So what that'll give me is the inches representation, since I know that this happens to be in feet. That little symbol up there is telling me feet. That's the units of measure that are showing to me. If you were in metric, I believe, I have to double check this, but I believe if you're in the metric world and you're using like millimeters or centimeters and you tell it to strip out the unit symbols, I think it's going to use whatever the Revit actual internal units are by default. So this might actually show up as millimeters, but I have to double check that. You'll find out as soon as you try this on your own projects. When I hit enter here, it's going to go ahead now and put 36 by 84. That's my naming convention that I want. No inch marks, nothing. It just uses the value because it takes this value times 12. Over here, I'm getting 76 1/4, which is what the value was. It was 74 inches 2 1/4. And so it does the math for me and figures out what it's actually supposed to be. As I scroll down here, my other type names are HM00_F_32 by 84. So I have all of my type names reconfigured the way that I want them. So I've done a little bit of work with formulas up here, but mostly it's just concatenations and a couple of if statements. I'm doing an if to ask it a certain cell value, and if it's nothing, I do nothing. Otherwise, I replace it with what I want. And then I concatenate that using the AND symbol across the way for each of the 4 fields. And each of the 4 fields is something special I'm doing. I'm taking the raw value and multiplying by 12 in one case. Same thing over here, or I'm, pre-concatenating with that underscore inside of there if it actually has a value. But now I've got all these settings. This is awesome, because now what I can do is go save my settings to a file. I'm just going to save these out on my desktop for the moment here. So I'm going to go into my desktop, and I'm going to drop my settings out there. Let's see, this is going to be my door type names. And you could have a number of type names. I'm only doing one at the moment. You could actually do, doors and windows and walls and everything all in one fell swoop. It might take it a little bit, but you could certainly do that in one big process so that it names all your types across your entire project. In this case, I'm just going to save this. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that you can do this process very rapidly for an end user. An end user never has to see this if you've saved your settings file. In fact, I'm not even going to apply this back yet. I'm just going to close this down since I've saved my settings, and I'm going to apply it in a different way. Now, if I did want to apply it right now, if you were doing this as a BIM manager and you want to do this as a one-time shot, you could go to Apply and apply your active worksheet, or if you had more than one that you configured, you could apply all worksheets. Any one that was down here at the bottom that's been configured to do something to your project, and it'll apply it back. No big deal. But in this case, I want to show you how an end user could run this without ever looking at this interface whatsoever. So I'm going to say no, don't save my changes because I've already done that. I'm going to go to Spreadsheet Link Express right here. This is a tool that lets you run a set of pre-configured settings from Spreadsheet Link directly in your project. So I'm going to load these from an outside file. if I'd actually save them directly to my project, I could just go load the settings from my active project, use my door naming settings, and apply those directly right here. But then they're only available to my active project. In my case, I like to save things out quite frequently because I like to use them all over the place. So I'm going to go ahead and browse this. I'm going to go grab my door type naming settings, and I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And it's going to, when I apply those settings, run through my project and make those changes. Now, keep in mind before, this door right here had the parenthesis 2 after it, or the 2. I don't know if it's parenthesis 2 or not. And it had the flush type panel in its type name, even though it had a full glass panel for its actual selection. And these doors up here had DR underscore. In fact, a lot of these doors had DR underscore. So what it did is it actually updated 22 objects. There was 4 types, or 22 types, I should say. There was 4 types that didn't need any update because they were already correct. And there was no errors, so it actually was able to name everything. So what I'm going to do is close this down, and let's take a look at this door. This now says full glass 32 by 84. So it already did the naming convention properly here. It does match up directly with the size. So if it's an 84 door, I'd expect it to be 7 foot, and 32, of course, I'd expect it to be 2 foot 8. So there it is. And it has the full glass and the HM00, all a part of that type name automatically. Over here, these other doors that used to have that DR underscore and the feet and inches naming convention, that's been swapped out now. Even though it's not necessarily a door that comes out of my standard, it does use properties that always exist, the 48 by 84, the width by the height. So I do have that. And that's true all over my project. I can grab this exterior door, which is one of the other doors as well. That's actually set up as interior, but whatever. 36 by 84. This door over here, it's an interior narrow light, again, 36 by 84. All the DR underscores are stripped off this everywhere in my project. So that can save me a lot of time. All right. There was a question that popped up about the spreadsheet link that said, since there are advantages of Spreadsheet Link over Kobe Link in some cases, and there's also advantages of the Kobe Link tool that Autodist provides versus the Spreadsheet Link tool, depending on what your workflows are, and even sometimes they complement each other, is it practical for some of you to use both tools? And the answer is absolutely. Kobe Link is fantastic for getting Kobe-specific data structured in schedules. That's what it does. It builds schedules, and then it takes that information after you've done some resolution of the information internal into Revit and exports it out for use by other tools. That's a great tool for that workflow. But it doesn't have a lot of spreadsheet editing tools that are available, and it doesn't have the ability to really go through and rapidly edit a lot of the data that goes into those schedules. You have to do that manually in Revit. Anytime a lot of people are doing a lot of schedule editing, especially when there's a lot of repetition in the field, I will almost always use Spreadsheet Link to edit that data inside of Revit. Now that's outside of today's discussion where, today I'm talking about type names, but there's a lot of uses of Spreadsheet Link, and certainly updating a lot of your Kobe data that exists inside of Revit before you export, it's a fantastic tool for that. So absolutely, I use both all the time. There's another question that popped up and says, you have an internal office administrator who makes Excel spreadsheets of interior finish schedules. I did not mean to put that inferior there. How do I take these Excel spreadsheets and import them for editing in Spreadsheet Link and basically automatically make a Revit finish schedule? Well, I'm going to tell you the answer to that. That's another discussion as well. But what I would normally do, I know that they have their own schedule right now. I would make a Revit schedule that pretty closely mimics exactly what they have, so that it has all the exact same fields in the same order, whatever they're used to. And instead of letting them start with their template, what I would do is I would take Spreadsheet Link and I would export a file from your current project out that already has all of the rooms listed and has all the fields in the same order for them. Then let them go nuts and edit it all day long. When they're all done editing, because it's going to look very similar, it won't be exactly the same, but it'll be very similar to what they're used to, then you can take that information and import that right back into Revit. Now, it's much more difficult if they are starting from their own Excel file and it doesn't have some of the information that we require to actually link it up. It's not impossible. I've done workflows like that, and I can work with you to certainly work out how that might happen. But it's easiest, it's the fastest workflow if you can get them to adopt your spreadsheet when you export it from Revit and have them go nuts and edit that. That's the best way. And you also are guaranteed then that all of the rooms exist, for one, and have the correct exact names and numbers based on your Revit project. Then they can go and do all the room finish editing that they need to do. So that's what I'd recommend there. Now, I have one more question that popped up here in a second. You also possibly need to make adjustments in Revit to this schedule, so you can present it to a client. Of course, they're going to be making changes in Revit, and then, yeah, you'll definitely be exporting that back out in Excel for that admin to continue editing. Now, the trick is, the hardest part here is coordinating where and when changes are made, because you do have to make sure that the changes are made by one source at a time. Because if you go through in Revit and make a bunch of changes, and in the Excel file, they're continuing to make a bunch of changes, when you export, you're either going to overwrite their changes, or when you import their stuff, you're going to overwrite yours. So you got to know what the actual changes are and when you're actually running imports versus exports and how to get that information captured. There's, again, workflow that we talk about for stuff like that as well. All right, I'm going to jump back on the topic here of today's example, and I'm going to use something that's just a little bit more complex than what I just did here with the doors. I am going to open up some settings that I actually acquired from a client of mine. This is actually a topic that I've done many times, and this particular client is an electrical contractor, and they do a lot of work with unistruts, with embedded, just single unistruts embedded in the concrete that are just basically poured in live, and they do a lot of single conduit hangers. Now, those of you in the piping world, you'd use it pretty much the same things, but you'd be doing it for pipe instead of for conduit. And those of you in the HVAC and ductwork world, you're doing the same thing but for ductwork, right? So on that MET front, similar concept. Those of you in the architecture and structural world, don't go away. The concepts are similar for you. You can see a couple of other examples of how this is working. Now, this is kind of a hybrid approach. I'm going to be toggling over to a different project here in a moment, to an electrical project. In fact, I'll do it right now. This is sort of a hybrid approach. Some of the intelligence is coming from the family doing some of the calculation, but because I can't get that type name to automatically update, and I get a lot of stuff like this in a lot of projects where I've got the size of the component, and I've got an identifier that's used for the prefab shop possibly, and I've got, people just duplicating things, and I get 2, 3, 4, depending on where I'm at in this project here, I'm getting different things all over the place. And I don't even necessarily know if I can trust the actual width, because who knows? Maybe they didn't update those when they were actually changing the values inside of there. And some of my content has different properties. For example, if I'm doing a level-based family like this unistrut component happens to be, I've got a parameter called base level, and I've got a top level, and I've got a base offset inside of here. Whereas if I use something that's more face-based, even though it's the same kind of an object sort of that I want to possibly prefab and have information that I can tag and no elevational information, I don't have base level inside of here like this guy does. This guy's got base level and base offset. This guy up here doesn't have that property. It only has elevation, and it has scheduled level. So there's a lot of times in Revit where there's inconsistent properties between different families of the same category just because they're based on different templates. One could be two-level based, one could be face-based, one might be wall-based, one might be just completely unhosted, like a generic model, just unhosted and floating in space. All those different things, I have to consolidate that all together and make it all work with a single tag. Now, to further complicate things with this, I want my type name configured, yes, but I also have other properties. I'm trying to tag the elevation of this so that the guys in the field know how to mount this and know exactly what elevation it's at. And I'm trying to give a little bit of other information here as well. So this information, a lot of this is actually instance-based. The type name is, of course, type-based. But in working with this particular client, we realize that oftentimes when they're updating the type names and the elevations, it happens at the same time. So how do you do both simultaneously, edit type values and instance values using Spreadsheet Link? Well, I'm going to go ahead and I could just run the settings directly because I've got them saved externally, but I'm going to actually open up Spreadsheet Link and show you a little bit of how this is configured. If I click on Spreadsheet Link, I'm going to go ahead and load my settings just so you don't have to watch me do this completely from scratch. What it's going to do is pull two things in. It's going to pull in specialty equipment, and it's going to pull in specialty equipment types when I do this. So it's going to pull it from both the categories and the types list at the same time. So let me load this from a file here. I'm going to go ahead and grab this particular settings file. Now, as it's loading these settings in, it's actually going to probably pop up a warning here in a moment that's going to tell me it couldn't load something. Specifically, it couldn't load conduit fittings because we're doing some stuff with that as well. But in this particular project file, I haven't drawn any conduit, and therefore I have no conduit fitting instances. So it just tells me it wasn't restoring that tab because there's nothing to restore. That's okay. That's cool. I'm just going to close this out. Not a big deal. But what you'll see here is I've kind of pre-canned this a bit, where I'm actually having data inside my type. I've got the size, in this case, the 10 foot. And I also have a formula here that says if D4 is nothing, use E4, because sometimes the size that I'm leveraging here isn't an actual width. Sometimes it's a diameter if I'm using like a specific pipe hanger or a conduit hanger or something like that. So I'm using the size as a part of that name in that case. So similar to what I did for the doors, if something is empty, do something else. So I said if D4 is empty, use E4 directly. Now I didn't do any extra logic to say if both of these were empty, do something. But you know, in my case, I'm pretty convinced that I don't need to do that for this particular workflow for this particular client. So if D4 is empty, use the value coming out of E4. So this is D4, this is E4. D4 is not empty, so it uses the value in D4. There's my 10-foot value, 10 foot 0 inches. And there's my concatenation little step again. And I'm putting a space and an open parenthesis. So space, open parenthesis, and then I'm concatenating in the value of F4, which is, we have a fabrication code that's built into the family directly. This is why I said this is a hybrid approach. In the family, I'm asking for certain values, and based on those values, I'm deriving a number of some sort. When I derive that number, then my shop knows potentially how to do their fabrication. Now, I'm not going to give you the secret sauce behind this number. That's the customer, that client. But the value that results from that, I can use that in my type name. And I'm going to concatenate at the very end there a close parenthesis. So that's where I'm getting, if I hit enter here, I'm getting this full name, 10 foot, and then I have a type that's a 100 type. And there's other columns out here as well, secondary codes, depending on other options that happen to exist. I'm not using any of that in these cases, but what it does is it puts a dot at the end, and then it uses, let me see here if I can do it right here. Yeah, there's a bit more of a complex formula here for the value called type code fabrication. That's also being used for tagging in some cases. But it's going through and doing a little bit more of a complex formula here, but I'm even setting not just the type name, but I'm also setting a property inside the type that's combining the type code primary, a dot, and the type code secondary, depending on what the values happen to be. And then also at the very end here, if there's a middle rod in use, if the thing's wide enough, it'll put that into this name here as well, which then gets used over here. So I'm basically using two fields of formulas to actually drive this all the way down my list. So at this point, there's absolutely going to be some changes to my names out here. Notice I've got a 3 foot dash 0 inches 100 space 2. Well, inside of here, I'm not going to have any of those 100 space 2s out there. It's going to actually give it the correct name all the way down based on the physical dimensions of that object. This actually isn't even 3 feet. It's 2 feet. So the name was completely wrong. Like, I don't even think I have any 3 foot pieces. I do have one. A 3 foot number 3 is what I've got there. At any rate, also over here for the instance properties, I was mentioning those two different values. Well, I've got the base level and the scheduled level. What I'm doing is with this base level manual, we run this sometimes just so we could tag the properties or put them into schedules and filter them, because you can't schedule in a lot of cases the base level depending on the category that you're in. And I also sometimes can't even schedule the schedule level depending on the type of category that I happen to be in. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And if you can't schedule it, you also can't tag it. In fact, neither of these two things are taggable. I'm making them taggable and schedulable and able to be filtered in a lot of different ways by using this property here. And then also, I wasn't able to tag the base offset or the elevation of most of these objects, nor was I able to derive the multiple tier elevations that I needed for their prefab, because Revit just doesn't give it to you. So what we did is we built in our own parameter, again, base offset elevation manual, and so it goes on the list and finds what level something is associated to, and based on that level, it derives what its actual elevation is going to be. Ultimately, I can apply these back to my project, and I can do this via Spreadsheet Link Express, which makes it run without me ever having to see these two tabs, or I can obviously open it up and just verify that the information is correct. I like to do that sometimes on a more complex configuration, just to visually inspect it and make sure my type names are doing what I'm expecting them to do as a BIM manager. Ultimately, when I tell it to go ahead and apply this, I'm going to go ahead and apply all worksheets back to my project, and it'll go through both of these worksheets and make the changes that it needs to make. So I'm going to go ahead and tell it, yes, I want to apply all values back to my project. It's going to modify both type data on one step and instance data on the other step. So across your projects, you can go nuts, and you can have it update all kinds of information, either automatically via Spreadsheet Link Express with some saved settings, or you can go in there and do some configuration and really get this to work out neatly to your favor, so that all the type names are now easily readable by users. They can understand what those type names are. Now, you might not know what 100 means. That's fine. But within that company, they know what 100 means, and that's what's important. So this happened to update 56 components. It left one of them unchanged. Something did not need to be updated because it was already correct, and there were 0 errors. That's important to me. I like not seeing any errors. So I'm going to go ahead and click Close here, and I'm going to shut this down and see what happened. So do I want to save my settings? No, I've already done that. Down here, you'll notice that I now have the 2-foot names instead of the 3-foot names, and it's starting to give me some extra information here. Now, I happen to know with this one, because that first number indicates how many tiers are on this, that some of these components should actually be multiple tiers. So I'm going to go in there and use another tag. Notice this, I've got this 12-foot value here. That's actually coming about because of that first tab process. It's actually acquiring the elevations of information. It's using the math internally in the file itself, in the family, to figure out the remainder of that data for the alternate tiers. But ultimately now I can go through and I can tag properties in my project that otherwise would be very tedious to try and go through and find a tag. And every single one of these objects now has exactly the right name after I run that. So, maybe I run this just before I actually want to run a plot, or I want to run a data export or something like that, because now I know all of these types are 100% accurate because Spreadsheet Link did all the work for me. I didn't have to make sure I went through and double checked each one of these. Nor did I have to go click on something whose name was really awkward and go edit type and try and figure out what the properties are inside of here first, reading through all these different components, and then try and update my type name accordingly. It just did it for me. So that saved an immense amount of time here. All right. I've gone through a very specific workflow for you today. This is one that maybe it doesn't necessarily, affect you too much, but I'm sure you're going to find uses for Spreadsheet Link in areas like this in your projects. Again, I did this both on component families, but this works equally well for type-based families like wall types, floor types, getting all those names based on properties of the object. You can certainly go through your projects and probably find a pretty good use for that in Revit. Just standardizing things, especially if you happen to be a company who needs to go out and download a lot of content off the internet. Understanding some of those types from outside sources sometimes is tricky, but if you can standardize the type names, that can really help to make the project a lot more usable when you're within the project environment itself. All right, I'm not seeing a lot of questions coming through at the moment. Hopefully that's because I've done a really good job explaining everything to you. If I have completely confused you, certainly throw some questions in there in these last few seconds here. I'd like to answer them for you. Otherwise, certainly go ahead and take a look at this video when we upload it online if you want to review this information. Or if you've got something custom in your company and you're like, wow, Sean talked about this, and I know this is probably possible, but I'm doing something different than what he's doing, and I don't quite understand what's up there. So definitely give us a call if that's the case. I love working with Spreadsheet Link and helping people find custom workflows that really work in their environment. So certainly don't be shy about giving us a call. We'd love to really help you out with that. I am seeing one question coming across here. The question is, where is the best place to review Excel formulas? All right. Personally, if you're writing them, if you're authoring them, the best place really is in Excel. I happen to have memorized a number of the formulas that I use on a regular basis, so I don't go directly to Excel. But to really understand and comprehend what you're doing with Excel, sometimes the best thing you can do is you can get your data all collaborated here inside a Spreadsheet Link, and you can save it out to Excel. In Excel directly, where you have things like heads-up displays and things like that, you can see a little bit more readily what some of the properties are that you need to use in the formulas themselves. Once you're done with that in Excel and you actually hit enter, you see the result of whatever it is you just modified. What you can do is just hit enter. It'll show you what the value is, but copy your formula out of Excel, open up Spreadsheet Link again, and definitely leverage that calculated value thing that we built into Spreadsheet Link, because Excel doesn't have that by default. You have to manually autofill those cells yourself. You have to drag that thing down depending on how long it is, how many rows you've actually got of data. In Spreadsheet Link, you can use that calculated value once you've got your formula written in Excel and just copy it directly across. Spreadsheet Link uses Excel formulas absolutely directly. Now, if you happen to be a company that uses something like OpenOffice, your formula structure is just a little bit different than it is in Excel. But here's the good news. Spreadsheet Link still consumes that. So you can still leverage that and still be pretty good to go. You shouldn't have a problem. If there's any little bit, little differences between OpenOffice and Excel, well, maybe you run your formulas in OpenOffice directly, save it, and then Spreadsheet Link can actually take the resulting values of that and bring it right back in. But it's still a much more automated workflow than manually going through and naming these things. So one individual was asking about if this could be uploaded to YouTube today because they've got a management meeting in the morning and they want to show this particular workflow. I'll let Nate answer that question. I know he tries to get these presentations uploaded as fast as he can. We'll see what he can do about that. There was another question in here about occupant loads. They're hard to update constantly. How can Spreadsheet Link do this? You know what? That's a fantastic question. And in fact, I think I have enough time here. I've got about 10 minutes before this has to kind of start wrapping up. Let me Control-Tab back over to that architectural project that I had open earlier. Occupancy loads are one of those things that are kind of, I've been dealing with them for many years, trying to figure out the best possible way to handle that. Now, in this case, I've actually built you a tag in this particular project that I use for occupant load testing because I get that question so frequently. You'll notice up here in my little offices, I've got an occupant load tag here. And one of the biggest problems with Revit is that their occupancy value, if I click on this room right here, if I go down to occupancy, occupancy is not a numerical value. There's not an integer there. If I type in, whatever I want, okay, I type in whatever, that's the value that shows up for my occupancy up here, which is not a number, which is not really very calculatable. That, and because a room happens to be a system family, I can't actually take occupancy and even make it a formula, even if it was the correct type of value, if it was an integer. I do, however, have myself a little parameter up here called occupant load factor, and if I happen to put in there a value like I need 50 square foot per person, this, because I made this parameter, it can have a particular data type that I want. I do have access to the area of a space, so I can know what that actual area happens to be. Let me change this to like 35 here. There we go. I can get access to the actual area of a space. And now, if you guys also happen to have done something like room keys, and you have load factors that are based on room types, you can do some nice automated things there that I don't necessarily need to edit via Spreadsheet Link. But once I get this value, this 53 square foot occupancy per person, and I know what the area is, I can actually, in Excel, do all the calculations all day long. And even though this is a text value, Excel doesn't care. I can do that math. Let me show you how. I'll do that one real quick. This is kind of outside the topic of type data, but this will be a little bonus for you guys. If I go into Spreadsheet Link here, what I'll do is I'm going to grab rooms. I'm going to go grab the rooms of my entire project here, every room that exists. I'm going to use a very similar workflow that I did for the doors just a minute ago. First of all, though, I'm going to grab the area that exists out there. That tells me the exact area of each of the rooms themselves. I'm going to go ahead and grab the occupant load factor. That tells me the square foot per person that's required if there's a value. Notice again, I've got the SF at the end of this. I don't feel like stripping those units away manually, so I'm going to go ahead and tell it to hide those unit symbols, which just gives me individual values, in this case, in square feet. It tells me the top of this is in square feet, which is important. The last thing that I'm going to include actually is the occupancy. Now, this is a text value in Revit. Notice how it says whatever right there. But what I'm going to do is make occupancy a calculated field. Excel doesn't care what the data type is. It could care less. So I'm going to go in here, and by making this a calculated value, and basically by hiding my unit symbols over here, I'm going to make Excel go through and do some basic math. Equals this divided by, there we go, this, enter. And so it's going to go down and it's going to find all of those ones that actually have values, and it's going to give it a number. Of course, this hashtag value exclamation point right here is telling me that Excel can't actually do a divide by nothing. So I'm going to have to put in a little bit of logic here. So again, we're going to go back to an if statement. If this equals nothing, then don't put anything there. Otherwise, do my math. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on there. So now it's gone through and it's cleared out all the values that are bogus out of that occupancy field. and it's only doing the math when there actually happens to be an area where there needs to be occupancies calculated. There's not a lot of places where I've got an actual value here. In this case, just that one room. But here's the trick about that. I don't want to be able to have 2.685 people in a space. That's not possible. You always round down. So I'm going to have 2 people in that space. So what I'm going to do is have to modify this again, and this is where, again, Excel might help you out because you have to know the structure of how this particular call works, but I'm just going to type it out because I happen to know it. Round down my math that I'm doing right here to 0 decimal places. Now, as I hit enter, that goes through again because this is a calculated value. It rips through all of my fields, and it makes this 2 as my occupancy. Now, what I would normally do at this point is save my settings out to a file. I'll do this out to my desktop out here. So I'm going to do my room occ calcs, and I'll save that. I don't even have to know what the room number is. I don't care because I'm not changing any values here. I'm just running some math. That's all I'm doing. So I've saved that file. Now what I can do, I'm not going to apply this back yet. So you're not going to see any of these values out here update just yet. I'm going to go through and run a couple more changes. I'm going to take my training room out here, which doesn't actually have an occupancy load on it just yet. And I'm going to tell it that this has to have, 25 square foot per person. Maybe this one over here, it's also a training room, but just for this example right now, I'm going to give it a different, come on, give me the room. There we go. I'm going to use a different value here, like 50 square foot per person. They'll make it double. They're comparable square footages here. We're going to see a very divergent actual occupancy in those spaces because this is 25 square foot per person and this is 50, so the math will be a little bit different. Of course, that office up there is going to update itself as well. So let me go here to my Express tools. I'm going to go to Spreadsheet Link Express because I don't necessarily want the users seeing that math. I'm going to go grab my room occupancy calculation. Now, I could run this at the same time as my doors if I put them in the same file. But I'm going to go ahead and apply my setting. This is just going to rip through my entire project. And as it rips through that entire project, I, as the end user, don't have to know at all what's going on, other than the fact that it comes back and says it updated 3 objects and left 151 unchanged. Well, what did it actually do? Well, it updated all my occupancies. Now, I've got 10 in that room, 21 in this room, and 2 up in this room. So how can you do your occ calcs super quick? Spreadsheet Link. Super awesome.